from that particular village.
That village, it's all the same case, and it's all the same few paramilitaries that were in the end not charged for the murders, because even the court said that they know that these guys, these paramilitaries, were there. Not even a question, but in the end it was not possible to prove who pulled the trigger, in a sense. So it was a really difficult case to follow. It took years.
And it's a very unsatisfactory result, I would
very much
argue,
yes, with the victims, the survivors also having to face those paramilitaries in court, having to testify over and over again.
Harom,
Du,
Jede.
Einmal.
Balkans Calling. Voices from the region.
This is the next episode of the Seafields podcast. This month is Roma month at Seafields. And we are talking to Rebecca Fisch, who is a pre-doc, a researcher at the Graduate School of European Studies here in Regensburg, and who is preparing research on the Roma in Bosnia, particularly on Roma experiences of the war in the 90s in Bosnia. We will be particularly talking about that, about her research. Perhaps a few words of introduction. Rebecca has studied cultural studies, literature, theatre and cultural diplomacy at the University of Hildesheim and the University of Belgrade. And then she did a master in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Amsterdam. She's been dealing with these topics already for many years, working with civil society organizations in Germany and Southeastern Europe, focusing on minority rights, anti-racism, memory, culture, transitional justice, and youth education. And she works as a trainer in human rights education, both Southeastern Europe and at the European level. So welcome, Rebecca. Very happy that you're here today to talk about your research. Yeah, perhaps I could start asking you to talk a little bit about yourself, your research, how you got interested in this topic, and how you reached this point that you are going to do a doctoral project on this.
Yes, thank you very much for having me and for the kind introduction. When I think about how I actually started being interested in that, it goes back to me graduating high school in Germany and then deciding to leave the country and wanting to travel the world and just go wherever. And I ended up in Bosnia, volunteering with a human rights Roma organization in Bijeljina, and very northeast. And working there for a year in the local community center with the minority. I did both like very classical NGO work, community work, but also I got introduced to the whole field of policy making, advocating for political topics, as well to the topic of Roma Holocaust remembrance. So I participated in some events on that as well. And after this one gap year, if you want to call it like that, I decided that I do not simply want to leave that as 1 year in between high school and university, but to continue working on it. So I started then also volunteering in this topic and stayed connected to both the region and questions of antigypsyism, violence against Roma in Bosnia, but also then slowly in Germany and on a European level. I graduated from my bachelor's in Hildesheim and Belgrade with a thesis on the role of artworks in Roma Holocaust remembrance, so artworks of survivors. Connecting both this cultural field of my studies with volunteering experience in human rights organizations and remembrance. And then I actually started working with the Central Council of German Sinti and Roma with an exhibition, a traveling exhibition that was traveling through the whole region of Southeast Europe, former Yugoslavia and Albania, sharing knowledge about and spreading awareness about the Roma Holocaust. So that was the starting point for that. And after 2-3 years working there, I decided to do my master's in Holocaust and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam, and to use that master's degree and the thesis that I anyways had to write to focus on a slightly different topic, to kind of switch fields a bit and to focus more on violence against Roma in the 1990s in Bosnia.
Yeah. It's very interesting that you did your master in Amsterdam. I also know that you were actually connected to the NIOD, the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation, at which I was working at the time. I mean, it's already 25 years ago. On Srebrenica. Yeah. So the NIOD did this particular research project on Srebrenica because it was, let's say, the Dutch involvement in the Srebrenica tragedy was, of course, quite important. And I remember that in a way we didn't have Roma so much on the radar, if you can call it like that. Perhaps that allows me to ask this next question. What is your view actually on research or writing that has happened in Holocaust studies in terms of looking at the experiences of groups that were not Jewish, let's say like the Roma. I'm not sure whether this was something that was given attention in Amsterdam in this program. Perhaps you can say a few words on that.
So I think we still see that this like classic Holocaust studies, in a sense, is very much focused on the on issues concerning the Shoah, so the experiences of Jewish victims of the Holocaust and survivors, and the Roma Holocaust and experiences of Romani groups, Sinti, we still refer to as the forgotten Holocaust, in a sense, because it's just took so much time for it to actually get recognized, for victims to get compensation, and even that is not standard procedure still. So it's still an ongoing struggle, and the little recognition that we see over the years, over the last 80 years, is an outcome of the civil rights movement of the minority itself. So especially like in Germany, but also many other countries, we see that through hunger strikes, through a lot of protesting, marches, many forms of engagement in that sense. Then that also started a lot of questions for other topics for me, because I was wondering why I, for example, never learned about that in high school. So I went to school in Germany, and it was just not part of my education, of my history education. So I started questioning how we actually remember, how knowledge and memory is produced in society, and what is considered worth remembering and what is maybe forgotten or ignored in society, in our history production. Yeah. And that, of course, then also leads to the topic that I'm more focusing on now, which is violence against Roma in the 1990s. Because as you already said, we do have a lot of research about the Srebrenica genocide, about the Bosnian War, about the whole splitting up of former Yugoslavia. There is a lot of research being done. And there is also quite a lot of research published about Roma integration, about policy supporting Roma inclusion, all of these topics. But there is a complete mismatch. Like these two circles are not really communicating with each other. So the situation of Roma facing racism, facing structural discrimination, facing everyday violence, still a very marginalized position in society, is addressed by policy making, by NGOs, by minority rights initiatives, but it's barely connected to the wars in the past, neither to the Holocaust nor to the genocidal violence in the 1990s. But the situation now is an outcome of both of these mass violence events in the 20th century.
Yeah. One of the things, I mean, before we perhaps move to Bosnia, I was a while ago in Heidelberg, where I visited the documentation center, it's called, really? I think, yeah.
Yes.
And actually talked to a person that was working there and explained to me that this documentation center was actually very much the product of civil society initiatives.
Absolutely, yes.
And not necessarily something that was supported initially by the German state or by whatever the federal, which I found actually quite shocking to see that that there was let's say very little official recognition of what had happened with the Roma and Sinti population during the Nazi period.
It really took a long time, yes. Yeah. I think especially now in the context that we're talking here, what is also super interesting is the role of universities and of researchers in that field, because a lot of this documentation that the Nazi produced during the Holocaust throughout the Second World War was then kept in university archives, for example, in many places throughout Germany. And only through a lot of pressure of the civil rights movement and of activists in civil society, of the minority and their allies, these were then released at some point. Like at the University of Tübingen, for example, it needed a strike, and the activists actually protesting at the building. So it's a lack of recognition on a political level, absolutely, and that took a long time. But it's also other actors, such as research, universities, and we also therefore still see, for example, a lot of hesitation when it comes to research being done on the Roma, because there's still this fear in the minority of who is talking about the minority without actually caring and without consulting the people that they're talking about, and just there's still this hierarchy and the fear of the consequences for that.
It's also a real issue in Germany, or at least it has been a real issue in Germany. Perhaps we should move to Bosnia now. I know you did your master thesis on Roma experiences of war in Bosnia during the 90s. Can you say a few words on the research you did for your master thesis?
Yes, so my starting point for that was mainly one survivor that was 8 years old in 1992 when his village got attacked.
What was the name of the village?
The village is called Skocic. It's also still existing. It's close to Zvornik at the Drina River at the border between Bosnia and Serbia, what is now the border. In 1992, Serbian paramilitary groups attacked the village. They set the mosque on fire and then continued to the Roma part of the neighborhood where around 30 to 40 people lived. And were all already gathered in one of the houses because they thought that that's how they could protect themselves and be safe from attacks. But in the end, that led to extreme violence, everything that you can imagine, from raping, stealing, all kinds of torture. And in the end, the entire community, the entire neighborhood was killed within one night and were shot and fell into pitches. And there's only one person who survived as an 8-year-old kid, Zio Ribic, who now talks about these events publicly as a survivor. He's sharing his story. And so far, he's one of the very few voices that publicly state that this is what happens, and he wants to share it. He also brought the case to court in Belgrade, supported by the Humanitarian Law Center in Belgrade as well. And then it was him as a witness and 3 other girls who were raped and then also brought to Serbia, being held captive, basically.
From that particular village?
That village, it's all the same case, and it's all the same few paramilitaries that were in the end not charged for the murders, because even the court said that they know that these guys, these paramilitaries were there, not even a question, but in the end it was not possible to prove who pulled the trigger, in a sense. So it was a really difficult case to follow. It took years.
And it's a very unsatisfactory result, I would
very much
argue,
yes, with the victims, the survivors also having to face those paramilitaries in court, having to testify over and over again. There's much more details to that than we can discuss now, but it is rather unsettling to follow that, yes, and to see that there's so little consequences for these actions. And that also made me wonder then whether that is the case with all cases like these where paramilitaries were involved, because of course they also were prepared. They knew how to act, so they leave as little traces of responsibility as possible, right? But what I also realized is that in the way that, for example, media reported about the case and how also both the court and the accused talked about the events, you see a lot of these stereotypes and antigypsyism actually in all of these different levels, both as in the motivation of the perpetrators, in decisions of the courts and in the media statements as well. So that's what I then started looking more into in this case specifically, but also then trying to find similar cases in the broader region in Bosnia to see whether this is really just a single story in a sense, or there are some patterns where the violence of the war and the aggression of these, for example, paramilitary groups are combined with anti-gypsyist stereotypes, anti-Roma racism.
Mm-hmm. And would you argue that, let's say, court cases like these were always sort of a real challenge for the victims in this case because they were Roma, or was there some justice done?
So there is very little structured knowledge about this in a sense of comparing different cases and documenting these cases. That's part of what I'm trying to do now.
Exactly.
Which is my starting point now. So I have some hints here and there for other court cases. I also started looking into notes of the ICTY cases, where, for example, in the case against Šešelj,
the transcripts of the
transcripts, exactly, yes.
Yeah.
In the transcripts of the case against Šešelj, for example, we have some Roma appearing as witnesses there as well when there's questions about whether they joined army voluntarily or they were forcefully recruited. Mm-hmm. And even in the few cases that I looked at so far, I always see these stereotypes appearing over and over again. So also the ICTY, the transcripts show that no one was really prepared for someone to appear in court who was not part of either the Bosniak group, the Serb group, or the Croat group. But who are you then? Like, what are you doing here if you're not part of one of these groups?
One of these three groups.
And they were quite confused about that. And then also this witness that I read about there said that, well, you keep calling me, or you keep calling my people the Muslims, but I think you're confusing something here, because yes, we are Muslim, but we're not the Muslims that you think we are. Like, we are Roma, and we are not part of this actually. And he even states that this was not their war. They didn't start it, but they were still suffering the consequences, which is then pretty much what I now call this irony that Roma were targeted as civilian victims in the war, like everyone else, like not much different. But they were also, in many cases, forcefully recruited to the armies, put in the front lines. But at the same time, they joined some armies voluntarily as well. So, for example, there's a whole brigade of Roma being talked about that was helping to defend Sarajevo during the siege in the 90s as well. Mm-hmm. So we have these stories, but they are not recorded really, and they are not listened to in a sense. They are not in the center of attention.
Which has, I think, a lot to do with how Bosnia is now, let's say, constituted as a state, huh?
Yes.
With the three constituent nations, as it is called, in this limbo, this Bosnian post-Dayton limbo, I would say. And then other groups seem to be invisible, right?
Yes, so that's pretty much the setting of the Dayton Agreement, that everything focuses on the three main groups, which is understandable in a sense that, of course, the main goal was to end the war and to establish a system that, at least for the time being, can end this massive violence. Mm-hmm. But what that led to in the end was also that all individuals and communities that were not part of one of these three groups of the constituent people were just in a stage of invisibility on the one hand, but also being quite blocked from also their human rights, in a sense, of political participation, for example, because you cannot even apply for some positions in the state if you do not declare yourself as a member of one of these three groups. And that's then not a question only concerning the Roma minority, but there's actually 17 minorities recognized in Bosnia as such, but then also all kinds of individuals from mixed marriages, for example, where a lot of families are quite mixed within all of these groups, because that's how we also know it from before the war, right? So it's not that easy to just divide a population of a country into three groups and that's it. When we talk about Roma, there is another level to that. So we have this invisibility on paper, in a sense, which is still then paired with minority rights protection, action of the minority language, Romanes. But we do see a lot of these anti-gypsyist images and stereotypes also very present in music, in all kinds of culture, in the language, these everyday stereotypes of stories that children grow up with as well. So if you're not behaving well, then the Roma will take you, or just be careful with your money because someone might steal it, and then we know who's the first person to steal, right? And all of these references constantly, which means that Roma are left in this paradox of hyper-visibility when it comes to these stereotypes. So whenever something
in terms of
is being
stigmatization,
stolen,
they're very visible.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and only when they fulfill certain stereotypes. So if someone is begging on the street, then they're very easily being seen as being Roma. But when it comes to actually coming to terms with the past, then we see this extreme invisibility, that there is simply no structural documentation, but also not a political lobby in a sense of both this narrative of the war to see who was actually affected by it, and at the same time also this very practical questions of, for example, if Roma were expelled from a village or a city and from their houses, to then get the houses back. Who is going to advocate for Roma to support them to get the houses back? Do the neighbors really stand up for them and say, like, yes, these were our neighbors before the war and we support them in coming back? So this is where we see these different levels of the specific Bosnian dynamics, but also, like, as in many other countries in Europe as well, this anti-gypsyism as a structural discrimination.
Yeah. I mean, at core, I would say, to your research, had this kind of contrast or paradox between hypervisibility in terms when it comes to seeing Roma sort of in this conventional stereotypical manner, but actually invisibility in terms of their war experiences and actually the traumas that they went through as individuals, as a community. I mean, how are you going to tackle this issue? Also in terms of the methods you're going to use. So, you want to bring, let's say, this on the agenda, if I summarize perhaps what your intention is. But for that, you need to, of course, apply, particular research methods. And I'm not sure how, let's say, in the Roma community, these experiences are dealt with. Perhaps you can say a few words, both about how they deal with these experiences where the rest of society is actually not listening to their experiences and only look at them in this very stereotypical manner, how they deal with that, and how you as a non-Roma going to, let's say, bring this to the surface.
So it's exactly these two strings, basically. So on the one hand, I'm looking at the mainstream society, at the majority population, to look into how we see patterns of anti-gypsyism in dealing with the past, in methods of transitional justice, which of course is anyways challenging, very much challenging for everyone in Bosnia, no matter the group, but then specifically for Roma with the second layer. My main interest is actually to document a lot of this violence and to document simply by asking questions through oral history interviews mainly, to just reach out to Roma communities and individuals, mainly so far in the eastern part of Bosnia and Sarajevo, but also to then go into different regions as well. And simply by starting to document it, because what I realized during my master's thesis was that very often the response is simply, well, no one asked us so far, which again shows that it's not a question of do we know this or not, but who actually cares about it. Does anyone who is not part of the minority even care about this kind of violent experiences? So this is one of my main tasks that I put on myself now, to kind of bridge these different knowledges and to connect these experiences into academic knowledge production as well, because I think it can also show us a lot about not only the specific situation in some small cases in Bosnia, but also in general how we talk about moving on from a conflict, coming to terms with the past in the whole area of conflict studies and transitional justice in a sense. and how questions of racism that pre-existed before the war, during the war, and after the war, how that actually then influences all these processes in post-conflict societies.
But, one of the most interesting, we have talked about your project before, but one of the most interesting aspects of your research, I find actually, this idea that, let's say, in the perception of Roma, of their own historical trajectory, the war may be one episode of violence that actually was there already before the war and actually continued after the war. Perhaps you can say a few words about these continuities of violence. Perhaps during the war it was very much the case of direct physical violence, but there are, of course, other forms in which violence is applied. Huh?
So there, for example, one case maybe, because I do have some records of an NGO that conducted some interviews and questionnaires in the late 1990s with some Roma in the Herzegovina and some other cities and regions, where the question was whether, what kind of violence Roma experienced during the war, and to simply start knowledge production about that. And then one of the participants in this questionnaire answered the question, which asked whether they were imprisoned in some camp, like it's referred to as concentration camps in Bosnia and in the original. And he starts talking about Jasenovac and about his experiences in concentration camps, and then realizes, oh, well, actually you're talking about the 1990s, right? So he's mixing up his experiences of being in prison as a kid in the fascist camps in the
beginning of the 40s, during World War II.
During the Holocaust, and then switches to the 90s and basically describes very similar experiences of violence there. And that is really important to my research now, in a sense that it does not make sense and isn't very helpful to only focus on what happened between 1992 and 95, but to also see that, for example, there was quite some violence after the 95 end of the war as well, which is also something that I know from working with Roma communities and organizations in Kosovo, where we see a lot of this violence actually happening after the official end of the war, and entire communities being expelled and forced to leave the country and their hometown. So this is something where we have very little work and research done in Bosnia. So I'm aiming to include that into my framework as well, to both look at how was the situation before the war, how were conflicts being dealt with, because of course racism did exist in former Yugoslavia as well. It might have showed in very different forms and then escalated into aggressive forms of physical violence during the war, and of course that's a very similar experience for everyone, right? That is a civilian in a country that is at war. But then also this question of how it was dealt with after is often, unfortunately, a continuity of this violence as well. It might come in different forms again, but it did not necessarily stop with the Dayton Agreement.
No, exactly. I mean, I'm also dealing with this process of ghettoization in Southeastern Europe, so where you can say that Roma are spatially segregated in many places in Southeastern Europe and are kind of ending up in what you could call ghettos, even though one can look at this concept critically, let's say. But it is also a form of violence through which Roma are evicted, let's say, from, the social fabric of a city and expelled to the periphery of a city and are kind of left on their own devices there. That's a form of current violence, perhaps, which you can identify. I mean, are you going to look at these spatial aspects, for example?
It is a big part of my research as well. Yeah. Yes, so we, for example, can look at questions of who returned to which regions, right?
Yeah.
Like exactly now in Bosnia, this question of also the different entities, the Federation, Republika Srpska, then also on a very local level, is it really necessary to advocate for the big recognition, the official speeches and a Memorial Day, or is it not something that is being discussed and being dealt with on a very local level? So I'm also going to look into that, into questions of neighborhoods, of these very small scale ways of just trying to live a peaceful life that is maybe a bit less violent than the past. But of course it affects every part of life, right? Like anti-gypsyism shows in education, in school segregation, it shows in the health and system, on the job market, employment rates, housing. Every part of life is affected by that. Of course, there is also not the one system how it works. Like it comes in so many different shades in a sense, depending, of course, both on the local structures, also on like political levels. Also, then, of course, questions of do people actually publicly say that they are Roma, or do they try to mask that and not to make that public? Which, of course, only works for people that do not fulfill the very stereotypical image of looking like they are Roma. It's a question of color or skin as well. So there's so many different levels to that, but definitely the spatial question is part of it. So we also see big differences whether we look into small villages like Skocic, what I was talking about earlier, or then Sarajevo on the seats, or Gorazd. So there's so many different aspects to that, yes.
Yeah. Okay, I would like to thank you very much for this interesting conversation. And I wish you really, good luck with your research, which I think is really important. So thank you very much.
Thank you as well.
Check out our podcast recommendation in the episode description